Howdy folks, welcome back to War Thunder with the mighty Jingles. Today I'm going to be taking a look at an utterly iconic Soviet jet aircraft design, the MiG-15. Well, I say Soviet aircraft design, but the MiG-15 was helped in large part by foreign assistance. The very quick progress of Soviet jet aircraft technology in the post-war years was largely down to foreign technology. The Soviet production of German Jumo 004 and BMW 003 engines was one factor, and the Soviets had also captured a lot of information about German research into advanced aircraft designs, particularly swept-wing aircraft, but not all of the assistance that the Soviets got from overseas was obtained as loot. Soviet engineers had been working on jet engines for quite some time, and the German engines were far in advance of anything that the USSR had on hand at the end of the war, but the German engines still left something to be desired. They were what were known as axial flow design engines, with a compressor made of axial fan blades on a shaft. Axial flow engines would prove the way of the future for high-performance combat aircraft, but they were tricky to get right, and the Germans didn't have access to the materials needed to make them reliable. The British, however, had focused on the simpler centrifugal flow engine, in which the compressor used something called an impeller, a lot like a water pump. Now, the centrifugal flow engine would eventually be overtaken by the axial flow engine for high-performance aircraft, something that the Germans got right from the start, but it was easier to build a centrifugal flow engine than an axial flow engine, and the British engines were much more mature than the German designs. In 1946, the Soviet aviation minister Mikhail Khrushchev and aircraft designer Alexander Yakovlev suggested to Stalin that the USSR buy advanced jet engines from the British. Stalin gave them the famous reply, "What fool will sell us his secrets?" But he let the exercise go ahead, with Artyom Mikoyan, engine designer Vladimir Klimov, and others paying a visit to the United Kingdom. To Stalin's utter amazement, the British were actually perfectly willing to sell. Unsurprisingly, this particular technology transfer remains the source of some sarcasm and criticism in modern documents, including some even written by Russians. The facts of the case, however, are a little bit more ambiguous. At the end of World War II, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had been replaced in office by Clement Attlee, and Attlee was nowhere near as suspicious of the Soviets as Churchill had been. The USSR had been Britain's ally in the war against Hitler when the Americans were still dawdling in the wings, and although the Soviets had been troublesome allies, there was still some lingering sympathy for them. For the moment, relations between the US and Britain were actually pretty poor, although they would quickly be repaired, and the technology in question wasn't classified information anyway. Also, Britain was broke. The British economy was on the bones of its arse, with the loss of almost all of Britain's overseas empire. Britain was desperate for money, and the one area in which Britain led the world was the design of jet technology. It was practically the only thing that Britain had available to export in order to pay for the food that was needed. Britain was still, for many years after World War II, under a rationing system. Of course, the deal was a complete disaster for the British, urged on and pushed through by the, frankly, communist British Trade Minister at the time, Sir Stafford Cripps. They did attempt to attach some strings to the deal. The Soviets had to promise that they wouldn't use the engines in military aircraft. "Oh, no, comrade," they said. "No, of course not. Civilian aircraft only, absolutely." And so the Soviets were supplied with a Rolls-Royce Nene Mark I, a Rolls-Royce Nene Mark II, and a Rolls-Royce Derwin centrifugal flow jet engine, as well as all of the technical blueprints and a license to manufacture them in the USSR. They immediately reneged on the terms of the deal, started fitting them into prototype jet fighters, and stiffed Rolls-Royce for the license fees. It was a complete disaster, and it soured relations between Britain and the USA. So, with the engines in hand and the technical blueprints, but not yet with the technical expertise required to actually build the components to the required standard, the Soviets set about working out the bugs of their production versions of these British jet engines. In the spring of 1947, the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau was tasked to build a fighter that would be powered by these engines, basing the design on swept-wing research performed by the Central Aerodynamics and Hydrodynamics Research Institute. The project was given the designation of I-310, and the first prototype, which was powered by one of the supplied British-built engines, performed its first flight on the 30th of December 1947, with Victor N. Yuganov at the controls. Apparently, The deadline of the flight was achieved not out of fear of Stalin's retribution, but because the test pilot actually needed the money. The weather was poor at the time, with low cloud cover, and there was no real problem in delaying the flight. But Yuganov was promised a bonus of 10,000 rubles if he flew the prototype, and he needed the money, so he took off, did 2 circles of the airfield under the cloud cover, landed, and collected the cash. So, ironically enough, it's probably safe to say that due to the British being desperate for money and selling the engines to the Soviets in the first place, and the test pilot rushing the initial flight because he was desperate for the bonus money he was going to get for flying it, that the quick development and early introduction of the MiG-15 into service as a fighter aircraft, that was more to capitalistic greed than it does to socialist dogma. And so the MiG-15 very quickly entered production, and it was a generation ahead of the MiG-9, the existing MiG jet aircraft, which was roughly comparable to American contemporaries like the P-80 Shooting Star, but the MiG-15 was a leading edge design by anybody's standards. It was a very clean all-metal aircraft, built mostly of aircraft aluminium alloy. It featured all swept wing flight surfaces, information gained from the German experience during World War II. It had a pressurised cockpit with a backward sliding bubble canopy, an ejection seat powered by an explosive cartridge, apparently the same used on the MiG-9. It had tricycle landing gear, all with single wheels, the nose gear retracting forward and the main gear hinging from the wings in towards the fuselage. The nose air intake, with a bulkhead running down the middle, fed an RD-45F centrifugal flow turbojet developed from the Rolls-Royce Nene, which provided 5,000 pounds of thrust. The rear fuselage could be pulled off for servicing the engine with a brake line at the hinge edge of the flaps. It had a very simple electronics suite, but it did include a radio compass, a radar altimeter, and an instrument landing system. Armament included a single 37mm cannon from the right lower lip and 2 23mm cannons firing from the left lower lip of the engine intakes. The prototypes had featured exactly the same weapons as the MiG-9, including the N37 37mm cannon and twin NS-23 23mm cannons, but the production aircraft featured a much more advanced NR-23 cannon replacing the NS-23, which raised the rate of fire from 550 rounds per minute to 850 rounds per minute. Ammunition capacity, 40 rounds for the 37mm, 80 rounds per gun for the 23mm. The cannon installation was pretty slick, with the 3 cannons installed on a tray that was hand cranked down out of the aircraft on cables for rearming or servicing. If additional trays were available, swapping in a preloaded tray rapidly improved the combat turnaround on the ground, and a gun camera was also mounted in the upper lip of the intake. One particularly Soviet design feature that you can quite clearly see there on this MiG-15 here, these sort of fins along the upper surfaces of the wings, they were known as fences, and they were there to control the airflow over the wings so that the airflow didn't spill off over the outside edge of the wing, and to ensure that there was the maximum amount of airflow going over the control surfaces. The Western approach was to design a dog-tooth wing, and Western engineers would often joke that the fences were there to stop the airflow from defecting to the west. The MiG-15 was officially announced to the west when it overflew Moscow in the May Day parade of 1949. By 1950, it was in combat in Korea. At the beginning of the Korean War, on the 25th of June 1950, the North Korean Air Force was equipped with piston-powered aircraft such as the Yakolev Yak-9, the Lavochkin La-11. Once the Americans and their allies got organised, they swept the North Koreans out of the sky. However, in November 1950, the US was alarmed to be confronted by a new advanced jet fighter that was heavily armed and left the US Air Force F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet fighters in the dust. The MiG-15 had arrived with Soviet pilots flying the aircraft. The United States Air Force quickly shipped new F-86 Sabres to the battle theatre to confront the MiG-15s, and the struggle for air supremacy was on. The MiG-15 and the Sabre were surprisingly evenly matched, and I say surprisingly because they'd been designed for completely different missions. The primary mission of the MiG-15 was as a bomber interceptor. It had a faster rate of climb, it had better high-altitude performance. The primary mission of the F-86 was an air superiority fighter. It had a slight edge in general manoeuvrability, better low-altitude performance. The weapons of the two aircraft also reflected these missions. The heavy cannon of the MiG-15 helped to ensure kills on big bombers, while the high rate of fire of the Sabre's 12.7mm Browning machine guns helped ensure a higher probability of hits in a dogfight. It seems that the MiG-15's powerful but slow-firing guns were an advantage for pilots who were good shots. while the Saber's lighter but faster firing weapons were an advantage for those who weren't. The Sabre definitely had something of the edge in sophistication, particularly with its radar gun sight. The cockpit seat was higher in the aircraft, which provided the pilot with a superb field of view, but on the other hand, the low seating of the MiG-15 gave the pilot more protection. The usual just get it working philosophy of the Soviet design also meant that there were certain niceties in the MiG-15 which were secondary considerations, and Soviet pilots who'd examined the very well thought out survival kits carried by F-86 pilots were particularly envious, sending examples back to the USSR for consideration by the engineers. Soviet pilots fighting in Korea also had nothing to compare with the American Search and Rescue Organization, though since they rarely if ever operated over hostile territory, it wasn't that much of a necessity. On the plus side, the Soviet pilots did regard the MiG-15 as much more sturdy than the F-86, and it does seem evident that the MiG-15 featured the famous tractor toughness of the very best Soviet gear. Pilots warmly called it the Samolyot Soldat. Despite my terrible pronunciation, actually means soldier aircraft. Many pilots insisted that MiG-15s that were claimed by the enemy as kills often made it back home and lived to fight on. Overall, as combat aircraft, the MiG-15 and the F-86 were so comparable that pilot skill was clearly the deciding factor in the air battle. In the end, the Americans would claim an 8-to-1 kill ratio against the MiG-15. Russian sources insist that this claim is exaggerated, and in return Soviet pilots have claimed a comparable kill ratio against American types. It's probably certain that both sides made exaggerated claims, however there are very good reasons to believe that the Americans did rack up an impressive kill ratio against the MiG-15, not because of any real defect of the type. The Soviets withdrew their pilots early in the war, and most of the Saber's victims were piloted by Chinese and North Korean pilots who were very inexperienced. The USA did eventually manage to get their hands on a MiG-15 for testing and evaluation purposes when North Korean Lieutenant Kim Ro-suk defected with one. It was evaluated by the famous American test pilot Chuck Yeager, who made a number of arguable claims about it, most notably that it was very dangerous in a dive, and he even claimed that Russian pilots he'd met in the USSR agreed with him. When asked about Chuck Yeager's claims, the pilots in concern unanimously replied, "Bullshit!" I think it's a mark of the quality of this aircraft that no Russian pilot, alive or dead, who ever went into battle at the controls of a MiG-15 regarded this aircraft with anything other than the deepest love, respect and admiration. And there are worse legacies for an aircraft to have than that. That was the MiG-15. I hope you found today's video entertaining and possibly even educational. As always, watch your six, and I'll catch you next time.